So my name is David Detmold, and I'm here to talk about the Massachusetts state flag and the seal of the Commonwealth. I come from Montague, a little distance on a icy winter night, but I'm happy to travel here to the Southbridge and talk with you because the town council here in Southbridge is considering a resolution in support of changing the state flag and seal. And that same resolution has been voted on now by 58 cities and towns, and 56 of them have supported changing the state symbol in the last 5 years. Those votes have come, and only 2 towns so far have turned it down. So we do hope that Southbridge will join that growing list of towns that are concerned enough about this symbol, this state flag, which we're going to look at right now together, to vote in support of changing it. It's changed many times over the past 400 years, nearly 400 years. And here's what it looked like originally when the Puritans came over in 1630, when they first landed at Boston Harbor. They brought this image with them. And this was from 1629. They actually created this image when they were still over on the other side of the Atlantic. And this was sort of their idea of what a native person looked like, that they might have worn this kind of loincloth made out of leaves, and that they might have welcomed the Puritans by this speech bubble that came out of the indigenous person's mouth saying, "Come over and help us." Yeah. Maybe that was a translation error, and it was supposed to say, "Come over and help yourself to our land." But in any case, this was the original symbol of Massachusetts Bay Company, the Puritans' sort of economic charter or enterprise was called the Massachusetts Bay Company, and it was chartered by the King of England and given the right to claim any land they wished that Christian people had not already claimed. In other words, other European powers had not already laid claim to. It didn't matter that there were people already living here because they weren't Christian, right? And so there was sort of this understanding among the European colonial powers that, you know, they could plant the flag here and it would become their land. They didn't have to negotiate or really, you know, fairly compensate the people who lived here. So it was an economic enterprise. Come over and help us might be a reference or would have intended to persuade investors in their company that they were here really to bring Christianity to the indigenous people of this continent. But it took almost 20 years before the Puritans sent out their first proselytizing minister to the Wampanoag. And they were not here primarily to save anybody's souls. What they were here for was to exploit the resources, which were so abundant and plentiful, particularly for the land which they settled. And within 3 years of the Puritans arriving, this is 10 years after the Pilgrims came, but within 3 years of the first ships of the Puritans sailing into Boston Harbor, 3,000 more followed. Englishmen followed and brought their wives and brought their livestock and just moved right in and began laying out roads and just claiming the land for their own. So this was the symbol they brought, and it showed a native person sort of divorced from society. You don't see that he, in this case, has a village around him. And what you do see is that he's not wearing a quiver, he's carrying a bow, and he's carrying one downward pointed arrow. And this is meant, or it's commonly interpreted to mean, that this native person has been pacified, not a warlike indigenous person, no quiver full of arrows to fight a battle, but someone who has already been pacified and pointing one arrow downward. And you'll see that this is our current state symbol. That's what we teach our children in 3rd grade in social studies class as part of the core curriculum when they study the state symbol. And what does a 3rd grader see? Well, they still see a Native American or an indigenous person with one downward pointed arrow, just like in the original that the Puritans brought over in 1630. So although it no longer says, "Come over and help us," there's a Latin motto now that says, "Peace under the sword, but peace with liberty." But the central figure and the central motif has remained constant, with some changes, for almost 400 years. And I consider that, and I think anyone looking at it objectively might also agree, that this really does speak to a relationship between the races of one being dominant and the other being subjected. In other words, white supremacy. I don't think that's overstating the case when you have the indigenous person crying out, "Come over and help us." Okay, so that's the origins of what we're looking at today. And it did change. Now, during the 5-year period of the revolutionary struggle, when they kicked the colonial governor and his troops out of Boston and took over running the show in what had been the colony of Massachusetts, John Hancock commissioned Paul Revere to come up with a revolutionary symbol for the struggling colony of Massachusetts that was trying to free itself from the king's rule. And this was the symbol that Paul Revere created. And for the first time we see the sword, okay? And it's held in the hand of a white person, soldier, Minuteman perhaps, holding the Magna Carta. That was the symbol of Massachusetts for about 5 years. When the Revolutionary War concluded, John Hancock, and they had the beginnings of what is now called the state legislature. At that time it was called the Governor's Council. The governor was John Hancock. And so he wanted something permanent. He asked one of his counselors, what we might call a state legislator today, to form a committee, and he really formed a committee of one. His name was Nathaniel Cushing, I believe, and to come up with the seal that would be the permanent seal for now the new state, one of the first 13 of the new nation of the United States of America. What they came up with in one version or another was very much rooted in that original symbol, where you have, again, a Native American or an indigenous person, let's put it that way, carrying one downward pointed arrow, no quiver, a bow, and above the Native person, beginning in 1780, you begin to see a white hand in one artistic rendering or another holding a sword above the Native person's head. And we are still looking, and this was one early version. Artists rendered it in a variety of ways. In 1890, or in 1885 actually, Secretary of State William Olin decided we don't want to see a number of different ways of interpreting what should be a common symbol from now on to represent the state of Massachusetts. So they came up with, in 1890, this final version, which we are still living with today. It's got the same features that you just saw, and this had changed. Sometimes the sword was huge, much, much bigger than it is there. And sometimes the Native person would be holding the bow in his right hand, sometimes in his left hand. And they just wanted to regularize it so it would always be the same, these same elements. And since 1890, it has looked like this. But what I think you've seen already is that since the original from the Puritans in 1630 until today, the state of Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, has gone through several iterations. In other words, it has changed. Historically, it has changed several times, and it could change again. So let's look at this. This is what we're living with. This is what we're teaching our school children. This is what we are projecting to the world as a symbol of our Commonwealth and representing the highest ideals of the Commonwealth, or so it should be. And what we see again is a native person with the downward pointed arrow, no quiver. The face that was rendered here by an illustrator named Edmund Garrett. He was chosen by Secretary of State William Olin to do the illustration. He chose a photograph of a Chippewa chief who was from Montana, and said, well, this is a fine specimen of an Indian, quote unquote. So they used his photographic image for the face. His name was Little Shell, not from Massachusetts. In choosing how to render the actual figure, the body of the native person, they used a skeleton of an indigenous person that was unearthed in what is now Winthrop. Okay, so they actually went to that length, as if native people have a different physical body structure than we do. They used a skeleton to make sure they had the proportions of the body accurate from their point of view. They used the bow that was taken from an indigenous person who was shot and killed by a settler named William Goodnoe in what is now Sudbury in the year 1665. So you begin to get a feeling like this is almost like a Frankenstein image of body parts, facial features, and accoutrements taken from, you know, the graveyard, the graves of native people. Never were native people consulted when this image was put together. The belt, they tried their best to model it after a red flannel belt that is held in the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, that is believed to be the belt worn by Metacom, who the English called King Philip. And so finally, the Secretary of State, in talking over how he wanted this to look and be rendered for the future, insisted that the sword be modeled after the sword of Miles Standish. So Edmund Garrett used the sword that is kept in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth, what used to be called Patuxet before the Pilgrims came. And so he used that sword, that particular sword, broadsword, that was and is still held there and believed to be the sword of Miles Standish. Miles Standish was the military commander of the Pilgrim colony, and native people remember this particular sword, and they remember Miles Standish for his brutal ambushing and decapitation of Massachusetts leaders only 3 years after the Pilgrims arrived in a place called Wessagusset. Miles Standish called what you might have considered to have been a parley. Let's get together and talk about our relations, and invited native people to sit down with him in a small hut, really, was all it was, a small room. And while they sat and talked with him, he ambushed and killed them and cut off at least one of their heads, brought it back with him, and put it on a pike in the center of Plymouth, and let it rot there. And this is the story that Massachusetts people remember about this particular sword. This is the sword of a murderer and an ambusher of native people. And you can look that up in the history books too. In fact, everything that I am telling you now comes from the Special Collections Room in the State House, where the records of how this was put together are kept, and in the State Archives in Boston. And also Edmund Garrett, the illustrator, felt so proud of his work in rendering all this into the form that we're looking at today, that he wrote a story about his efforts in designing the flag and seal of Massachusetts and published it in a general circulation magazine called the New England Quarterly in the year 1900. And that can also be found online as an original source from the illustrator himself. And never was this intended to be in any way an honor of Native people. Edmund Garrett called Native people in his article poor savages, and he said that he himself knew them very little, but that people who were most familiar with Native people liked them the least. All right, there's another quote. I've kind of mangled that quote, paraphrased it, but he's basically saying, you know, the state of Massachusetts is named after a Native nation, the Massachusetts tribe that inhabit and still live in the area around Boston, what was then called Shawmut. So since we're named after them, we're going to keep keep this image and the image that we've used ever since the Puritans first came. But in no sense was this meant to be an honor to Native people, nor were they ever consulted before their imagery was used. And that is just a violation of Native rights, in my opinion. You can't take something from another culture and claim it to be yours without consent, consultation, and approval. And I think we understand that today, particularly in a state like Massachusetts, which prides itself on, to some degree, being a progressive state. The first state to have recognized gay marriage, the first state in many respects to really break a lot of barriers and boundaries that other parts of our country have followed us on, but not in any sense have they come to terms with their relation with the Native people of this Commonwealth, who are still very much here and living with us today. In Southbridge, right here in the middle of Nipmuc territory, our school children in Southbridge, they have this symbol on the stage in their auditoriums. Our city has this on the town hall stage at the town council meeting room. When you see a state patrol vehicle go by, this image will be stenciled on both doors. When you drive into the city of Southbridge or any town in Massachusetts, there'll be a highway sign right there saying entering Southbridge, and right in the middle there'll be a white hand holding a sword over the head of a Native person. And think how Native people feel when their children go to the public schools and have to see this flag in the hallway or on the auditorium stage. Imagine if the roles had been reversed, and if King Philip's War, which was the bloodiest war ever fought in America per capita, if it had gone the other way, and it was a very close battle, as the folks in Brookfield can tell you from their history books. It was a very hard-fought battle for Native lands. And if the victor had been not the colonial settlers, but the Native people who had first welcomed the Pilgrims, kept them alive through that first winter of starvation, taught them how to farm, how to grow corn, and gave them their first leg up, so to speak, on these shores. If they had prevailed in that conflict, and the whites had become the minority, and there had been a huge tomahawk over their heads, and our children went to the schools and had to study that as a symbol, how would you feel? So it needs to change, if you don't mind my saying so. And I'm not the only one saying this. Is when I mentioned the Massachusetts tribe, here's the Sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe at Wampanoag in 2019 in front of the State House, saying it's time to change the flag and seal. And for 36 years in a row, from 1985 until 2020, the legislature had a bill in front of it introduced with the support of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, first under John Slow Turtle Peters, the medicine man of the Mashpee Wampanoag, who introduced, with the help of Byron Rushing, African-American civil rights icon and state legislator from Boston. In 1985, they introduced a bill to examine the flag and seal and recommend changes. And from 1985 until 2018, when Byron Rushing left office, he introduced that bill every 2 years. He rose to be the majority whip, as I understand it. Or anyway, he was high up in the leadership at that time, and he still couldn't get his majority white colleagues to even set up a commission to study changing the flag and seal, until more and more people began to support the call of the indigenous leaders who'd been actually working on this for decades before Byron Rushing had brought it to the legislature. And, you know, in my area, 4 little towns, including Orange, which had voted, I'll say, in the majority for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, so you would not necessarily call this a very liberal town. But on this issue, Orange joined with New Salem, Wendell, and the little town of Gill in the year 2018 and voted to support changing the flag and seal and to set up that special commission to do so. And the year following, close to 30 more towns joined them. And at that point, when small cities, small towns, from Provincetown to Great Barrington and everywhere in between, began demanding that their legislators and that the legislature as a whole change this, and to support the call of Ferries Gray and many other Native leaders before him and with him to change this. Only then did the legislature finally act, after stalling for 34 years in a row. And so they set up the special commission, and that bill passed the Senate, state Senate, unanimously in the summer of 2019. They're only setting up a commission to study it, after all. Then we had to get the House to agree, and that took some doing. But finally, on the morning of January 6, 2021, a date that lives in infamy for the riot that broke out in Washington, D.C. that afternoon, in the wee hours of that morning, the House nearly unanimously supported what the Senate had already agreed to. And that bill finally passed. It finally moved. The Republican governor, Charlie Baker, at that time, signed the bill because it had such overwhelming legislative support, and it was so obviously needed. And yet he slow-walked appointing the 19-member commission. They were supposed to report back their recommendations for changes to the flag and seal by October of 2021, and he hadn't even finished making the appointments until November of that year. The legislature gave the special commission no money to work with. And so members of the special commission included 6 Native American leaders of the area we now call the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And they were to sit with state legislators, historians, and the Secretary of State's designee and others to come up with recommended changes, and to do the public polling for new design elements, and to commission artists to come up with a new design so that it could then be voted on. But they were given no money, and again, the governor didn't even finish making the appointments until after the deadline for their recommendations was due. So the legislature, in its wisdom, extended their deadline until December 31st of last year, 2 months ago. And finally, in November of last year, middle of November, gave them $100,000 to work with. But by that time, they only had 6 weeks left, really no time to complete their work in an orderly fashion or to spend it. So that's where we stood as of December, just 2 months ago, with this first effort, really, to consult with Native people. This is the first time Massachusetts, as a Commonwealth, has sat down with the chairwoman of the Wampanoag, the chairman of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the chairwoman of the Herring Pond Wampanoag, and the designees of the Nipmuc Nation, and the designees of the Massachusetts tribe at Wampanoag. And to sit with them and to hear from them the harm that this symbol has created for them over the centuries, and to their children who go to our public schools and live in this society and have to see this flag flying everywhere. And so at the least, and yet this is very significant, I believe, what they came up with were written findings, and here they are. These are the findings of the Special Commission as of December. Massachusetts should create a new design for the seal and motto of the Commonwealth. Massachusetts should incorporate symbols and terms in a new seal and motto that are inspirational and inclusive of the diverse perspective, history, and experience of Massachusetts residents. And finally, Massachusetts should dedicate more resources to educating the public about the history and cultures of Massachusetts, in particular, the indigenous history and cultures of Massachusetts, the history and usages of the current seal and motto, and the harm inflicted by the current seal and motto, and the efforts to change the seal and motto. And when we get to that last phrase, I'd like to point out that among those efforts, in support of the call of Native leaders to change this symbol, your own town council here in Southbridge is now considering a resolution that would support the work of the Special Commission and call upon your state senator and your state legislators to get this done. Okay, there's a new governor now. She could issue an executive order to take down the current racist flag and seal immediately and allow time for a new symbol and a new design to be created. This is what the state of Mississippi did finally after the murder of George Floyd in summer of 2020. After decades of discussion about the fact that their state flag was still the Confederate battle flag. In a state with 36% of the population African American, Mississippi continued to hold on to the Confederate stars and bars as their state symbol. And we like to say, we said it in those days, Massachusetts and Mississippi are in a race to the bottom to see which state will hold on to the flag of white supremacy the longest. Well, finally, the Governor Tate, I believe, in Mississippi, right after the murder of George Floyd, issued an order to take that flag down and to give, I think, 3 months to the legislature to come up with a new symbol. And they consulted Native people in Mississippi when they came up with that beautiful magnolia flag that they're flying today. And so, unfortunately, my friends, what I have to say is that Massachusetts lost that race to the bottom, and we are still flying this flag. And Southbridge has a voice in this, and it could be a very powerful voice. And we sincerely hope that Southbridge Town Council will vote in the coming weeks to change the flag and seal in Massachusetts. And here's the hope. My state senator, I'm from, as I mentioned, Montague, just a little bit south of the Vermont border in the Connecticut Valley, and my state senator, Joe Comerford, was one of the lead Senate sponsors of this legislation. And she is not alone in this, is saying that the money did not go away at the beginning of the calendar year. They gave them the $100,000. They forgot to extend their time frame as they had been asked to do by the Special Commission. The Special Commission just wanted 3 more months, until the end of March, and the money to go around the state and do listening tours in cities in towns just like this one, to find out from the public what the public would like to see for a new design, for new design elements. Well, they got the money, but they didn't get the time extension. So Senator Comerford, among others, is suggesting to the Special Commission that they just keep going, that they meet again, that they do that work. The money is good until 2025. It doesn't go away. And so as long as the Commission feels like it can extend its mandate, They've been given the money, and the legislature is, according to my state senator anyway, waiting and hoping for a final design. But what I think is very clear from what the last slide shows is that in the time frame that they had, they came up with a unanimous decision that we need to change this. The legislature set them up and asked for a recommendation, and the recommendation is clear. The current symbol has to go. And I think Governor Maura Healey, if I could speak to her directly, I would say to her, do the right thing and take this down now, just like Mississippi took theirs down, and tell the legislature to get busy with a public process for a new design. And if the special commission can be reconstituted, reappointed, or just reaffirmed, whatever it takes, the people on that commission have studied this carefully. It includes a graphic artist who worked on the flag in Mississippi and happened to move to Massachusetts right after that. And so he'd be an excellent resource to help Massachusetts figure out how to go through the same steps that Mississippi just went through. You know, states change their symbols, states even change their names. Rhode Island used to be called, up in just about 2 years ago, Rhode Island and Plantations. And Gina Raimondo, I believe, was the governor, and she just said, we're gonna get rid of that word and plantations. And they put it to the legislature, and they did that. Sometimes people say, you know, you're trying to change our history. You know, we resist this impulse to change our history. And whenever I hear that, I say, unfortunately, we cannot change our history. Our history is what it is. What we can change is the future of our relationship with the indigenous people of this land. And we really need to change and enter into a much more respectful relationship with the people who are still here among us, who have lived on this continent for 10,000 years, and know how to live in this land in a way that does not deplete its resources for our children and their children. This is what we really need to be talking about, is in the environmental crisis that we are in right now, setting up respectful relations, entering into this dialogue, allows the door to open for meaningful communication from the people who have been stewarding this land from time immemorial. And I think the settler society of which I am a descendant, and many of the people who might be watching this video also are descended from, we have a lot to learn. In all humility, we have a lot to learn. And this is just one step in the direction of improving the relations. We can't change the history, we can change the future. What I keep saying is it doesn't need to cost the taxpayers of Massachusetts a lot to do this. This symbol appears on stationery that is printed every year. They can just print new stationery with the new image. Flags wear out and need to be, you know, they do wear out and they need to be retired. And, you know, printing new flags is not going to be a huge cost. It really isn't. You know, putting the stencil on the side of state patrol vehicles, well, that will be a cost, but I think it's a cost that we really should bear if we wish to really, when you're talking about institutional racism, this symbol is the primary example where we live. And if we're not willing to assume some cost, well, then what does that say about us as a society in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, and just a basic humanity, that we all live in this Commonwealth together, and we should not be dealing with an image that so obviously is reminiscent of past genocide of one race against another. What I do advocate for is changing this one and finally consulting with Native people whose image we have borrowed and appropriated for 4 centuries. And if the Native leaders who have served on the Special Commission come to agreement as to what they would like to see in terms of indigenous elements of a new design, I would be wholeheartedly in support of whatever they said to us they would like to see. only because, if for no other reason than that we have shamefully taken their imagery without their consent and used it in this shameful symbol for four centuries. So I think a debt is owed there, and the consultation is ongoing. And whatever they come up with, I'm going to be supportive, believe me. I was so happy to be able to speak here. My friend Jasmine Rivas, who's on the town council, with at least one other member here in the audience, has brought this to the attention of the town council, and I'm very hopeful that it will move forward to a vote in the coming weeks. And if there are any further questions from people who might see this on the cable television or on Facebook Live, read about it in the newspaper, I can be reached through the website changethemassflag.com, changethemassflag.com, and I'd be happy to respond to any concerns or any questions that you might have. And thank you again for your kind attention. Thank you very much.